Hello. In this short lecture today, I'm going to talk to you about judicial independence. Judicial independence and judicial neutrality are both very important aspects of our study of the UK judiciary, and students can have a tendency to get them muddled. So I do recommend you also watch my lecture on judicial neutrality alongside this one, but this one will focus on judicial independence. So first of all, what do we mean by judicial independence? We basically mean that the judges are not controlled by politicians, not controlled or pressured by politicians. That there's what we call a separation of powers between the parliamentary and executive branches of government on the one hand and the judiciary on the other. Now, what's the point of judicial independence? What's the purpose? Well, it's very simply so that the judges can apply the law properly without fear of consequences. To enable them basically to not worry that their judgments are going to result in some kind of backlash for them if they anger politicians or the government in the process of making their judgments, and so they can focus solely on the points of law involved. So how is judicial independence maintained? Well, there's a number of mechanisms in place designed to guarantee and uphold judicial independence and to limit the means by which judges can become subject to external pressures from people like politicians. First of all, and probably most importantly, judges have what's called security of tenure. This means they're appointed for life and effectively, therefore, cannot be sacked. Technically speaking, they can be sacked, but only if both houses of Parliament petition the Queen to do so, and that is very, very, very rare. So they have security of tenure, they can be sacked, and therefore when they're making their judgments, they don't have to worry that if their judgment angers the government, they'll find themselves out of a job the next day. That can't happen. Secondly, and due to a similar principle, they have guaranteed salaries. Their salaries are set by what's called the consolidated fund, which is not controlled by either Parliament or the executive. So again, they don't have to worry that if they make a ruling against the government, they're going to suddenly find their salary cut in half the following year. Their salaries are guaranteed and controlled by the independent consolidated fund. Thirdly, we have the principle of what's called sub judice, which bans media comments, public comments on cases that are currently before the courts. And if people breach this, they can find themselves subject to what are called contempt of court proceedings, which is what recently Tommy Robinson, the infamous rabble-rouser Tommy Robinson, found himself subject to, and actually spent several months in prison for contempt of court when he actually reported on what was happening in a case that was currently before the courts at that time. Fourthly, judges are almost entirely immune from being sued or prosecuted for what they say or do in court during their judicial work. So again, this gives them the independence to speak freely, speak their mind and so on without having to worry that they're going to be sued for that. Fifthly, they have obviously a high level of training, and obviously the more senior judges have a high level of experience as well. And so this is also thought to ensure that they respect and uphold and know how to uphold the principle of judicial independence themselves and know how themselves to resist any possible political pressure. And finally, by convention, politicians are not supposed to give their opinions on judges' rulings, because it's thought if they were to do so, again, that could put undue pressure on the judges to conform to what politicians demand. In addition to these basic mechanisms, which have been in place for some time, the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 was also specifically designed to enhance the separation of powers between the judiciary and the other two branches of government. And it did this in two main ways. First of all, it aimed to increase the separation of powers between the judiciary and the legislature by removing what were then called the law lords from the House of Lords. Now, these were the 12 most senior judges in the land, and until October 2009, they used to sit in the House as members of the House of Lords. And the House of Lords was at that time, as well as being the second chamber of the legislature, also the country's highest court of appeal. Now, the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 changed that all. It basically stripped the House of Lords of its judicial functions by removing the law lords from the House of Lords and placing them in a separate Supreme Court, which started operating in October 2009, and that's what we have today. Now, the purpose of this, as I say, was to increase the separation of powers between the legislature and the judiciary, and thereby enhance judicial independence. Secondly, the Constitutional Reform Act also increased the separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary. Before the Constitutional Reform Act was passed, the Lord Chancellor, who was a member of the Cabinet, appointed by the Prime Minister, had a major role in overseeing the judiciary and especially in overseeing judicial appointments. Now, the Act has substantially reduced the powers of the Lord Chancellor and specifically reduced his power power over appointments. And it did this by establishing an independent appointments system. It established what's called the Judicial Appointments Commission to oversee appointments of judges at most levels of the judiciary, and also for appointments to the Supreme Court. When a vacancy arises at the Supreme Court, what's called an ad hoc committee is established of 5 senior people, and they make recommendations on who should be appointed to the Supreme Court. Now, this replaced the old system, what used to be called secret soundings, where the Lord Chancellor would basically have private interviews with, senior people and just base his decision on those secret interviews. So there's thought to be a more transparent system, which removes the power of the Lord Chancellor, removes a lot of the powers of the Lord Chancellor in terms of choosing and appointing members of the judiciary. So this too has increased judicial independence by making the judiciary less subject to political control by the executive. Now, this increased independence of the Supreme Court has, some argue, led to an increased willingness of the Supreme Court to challenge both government and Parliament. And this can be seen in a number of cases where the judges have challenged government decisions, such as ultra vires rulings we've had against asset freezing measures in 2010, against Jeremy Hunt over the closure of parts of Lewisham Hospital in 2013, and against the Welfare to Work scheme in the same year. Excuse me. Not to mention the controversial 2016 Brexit ruling by the Supreme Court, where the court ruled that Theresa May could not request Britain's withdrawal from the EU without first obtaining parliamentary approval. However, there are some limits to judicial independence. Firstly, parliamentary sovereignty means that none of these mechanisms we've discussed, including the Constitutional Reform Act, are entrenched. Effectively, they're there due to the goodwill of Parliament and could be removed by Parliament at any time. Remember, parliamentary sovereignty gives Parliament the right to make or unmake, that is, repeal, any law at any time. So it could change any of these mechanisms at a stroke, should it feel the urge to do so. Secondly, the Ministry of Justice, which is obviously part of the executive branch of government, it's government department, still exercises considerable influence over the legal system. Now, one example of this came in 2011, following the inner city riots of that summer, when the Ministry of Justice issued instructions to the courts to ignore their normal sentencing guidelines and actually hand out prison sentences to everyone involved in the riots. Now, this was a clear case of the executive attempting to control what should properly be strictly judicial decisions. Thirdly, third limit on judicial independence is that despite the creation of the Judicial Appointments Commission, judges are still ultimately appointed by the executive, and the Prime Minister still has the power to veto the recommendations of the JAC. Furthermore, there have been some increasing threats to judicial independence in recent years coming from politicians and the media. Effectively, this convention that politicians should not comment on judicial rulings has become increasingly fragile. Now, the creation of the Supreme Court has, in some ways, increased the public profile of the senior judges, which has led to an increased media interest in their work. And this has perhaps exposed them to increased media pressure, especially following the 2016 Brexit ruling, for example, when the tabloid press printed front-page pictures of leading judges under the headline, "Enemies of the People." And following that ruling, the then Brexit Secretary David Davis broke with the convention and also publicly criticised the judge's verdict. Previously, Home Secretary David Blunkett, who was Home Secretary under Tony Blair, had also criticised judges' rulings against some of his decisions, calling the judges dictators in wigs. And in 2011, Theresa May, as Home Secretary, had also criticised judges publicly for using the Human Rights Act to block deportations of immigrants. So all of this adds up to increased media and political pressure on the court, which could potentially undermine their independence. So to conclude, judicial independence does exist in the UK, but we could say it's been shaken in recent years by an increasing willingness amongst politicians and newspaper editors to pressure judges to fall in line with their own prejudices.